As you know, it's important to define terms when we're talking about something as subtle as realization, awakening, enlightenment, etc. So I do want to point out a distinction between the terms consciousness and awareness. But first of all, I want to say that there are many different uses of both of these terms, and I see them used in very different ways quite frequently. So just understand that I'm not saying with these definitions that this is the only way to perceive these characterizations. It's just the way I generally use the terms, and perhaps the distinctions I make here can be helpful in the moment to perceive what I'm really pointing to when I talk about consciousness and awareness. So when I use the term consciousness, a very simple approach to what that means is to say that what I'm talking about is the realm of thought, but I'm not talking about being lost in thought. I'm not talking about the narrative of a single thought. I'm not talking about the content of a thought. What I'm really talking about is what thought is actually made of. I'm also talking about what the sense of I is made of, the sense of you being the one that is perceiving in the most basic way, in the barest form of that experience. So these are definitions. The definitions won't really take you very far unless you really inquire to break the spell of dualistic consciousness. By just memorizing what I said, at best, you'll just have a conceptual understanding. At worst, you could believe that you have realized consciousness or unbound consciousness, or have had a shift, a Kensho awakening, when it's really just a conceptual understanding with maybe some experiential taste. So I give that caution so that you understand that to know this intellectually is one thing, but to actually experience the shift in identity is a very different thing. And I have extensive videos on this in the consciousness playlist, the thoughts playlist, inquiry, all of these approaches to that first shift or first awakening. So what I would say is when the experience of self-consciousness stops being dualistic and is experienced as consciousness unified. And again, you won't be saying to yourself, I'm experiencing consciousness unified. It's a fundamental shift in how we experience ourself primarily, but also life. That is what I mean by consciousness. It is the ability to self-reflect that does not have to be dualistically experienced as self-reflection. That is what consciousness is. And even when it is realized, when there has been an awakening, we still have the ability to self-reflect in a dualistic way, but it's always in the context of a non-reflective experience of pure self, or you could call it self with a big S. The realization of this is what awakening is, in the way I define it. Now, there are different depths to awakening. Some awakenings are much more, say, on the shallow end, where it just feels like a pure experience of I, or a pure experience of you as consciousness, or as perhaps everything, but it's all made out of consciousness. On the deeper end, it goes even beyond the sense of I, because we realize that without the self-reflection, the dualistic self-reflection, then what does I even mean anymore? So it becomes this more bare experience. Perhaps you could call that the beginning of the experience of awareness. So Nisargadatta specifically makes a distinction between consciousness and awareness in that he describes consciousness as having the ability to self-reflect, or it's self-reflective or self-aware, whereas awareness is not. And the example would be in deep sleep, not in dreaming sleep where there's content, but in deep sleep where there's no content, it's contentless. There's still this sort of bare awareness present. So that's the distinction between consciousness and awareness. They may sound similar and they have a lot of overlap experientially, especially in early stages of realization, but at some point you start to actually recognize the difference. Now, taking the experience of pure consciousness, or even everything is consciousness, where it actually appears like the world is made out of consciousness, to be the final position, is a sort of mistake or a misjudgment, because it goes a lot deeper than that. But there's something about that experience that makes it feel quite complete. It's self-validating. It's just that if you keep your mind open, you keep your heart open to something even deeper than that, you might be surprised where it goes. Because beyond that, things get, again, very difficult to talk about. They get paradoxical. Words really, really fail here. But there can be realized this experience of a sort of formless, aware space, but it's not so much a space. And it feels as if everything sort of appears out of it and disappears back into it. You could call it like a background where there's only the background. It's described in many different ways, but it has a feel to it. Now, to take this as the ultimate position is also sort of an error, because it does go deeper than this. Because if you really start to investigate your experience, you'll find that to hold awareness as some kind of final state, stage, background, or ground of experience, you're holding on to subtle conceptualities without realizing it. There's something that is immediate, doubtless, requires no self-consciousness, and becomes more and more prominent in your experience in deeper stages of realization. And that is the pure sense fields. When you start to experience the pure sense fields, and then you start to investigate how awareness relates or fits into the pure sense fields, you realize there's no such thing, there's no such experience as awareness outside of a sense field. This, when it's realized, and again, it's easy to believe this or understand it or have a taste of it without fully realizing it. But when it's fully realized, it's very clear non-dual experience, meaning there's no sense of space or awareness as such, or awareness holding space or space holding awareness that stands on its own. It was a sort of remnant or perfume of what we feel like is our internal space, our internal world. And it's made out of mind stuff, or you could say the remnants of thought stuff. But it's not the content of thought, it's not the substance of thought, it's not the consciousness that thoughts form in and as, and even the sense of I forms in and as. It's more like the potentiality for that consciousness to be there at all. Again, it's like a space, but it's not a mental space. It feels very real experientially. So it takes some subtle inquiry, some careful inquiry into your actual experience to see what's going on, to clarify that even awareness does not stand on its own. This is very important for clear non-dual realization. That's the non-personal aspect or impersonal aspect. What's interesting is this comes hand in hand with the personal aspect, which also has to be addressed in this process, which I talk a lot about and we have gone over a lot recently, including the recent retreat, and that is shadow work. The uber personal experience, the experience that's so intensely personal that it's a near constant distraction. That part of our experience we want to overlook by becoming so enlightened and dissolving ourselves into nothingness or bare awareness or something like that. So these investigations actually go hand in hand, although they feel very different. Because the personal aspect, the shadow work we're doing, the emotion work, the grief work, all of it, it feels personal. It feels very much along the lines of the personal narrative, even if we've seen there's no person. Still, the tendency, the pull, the gravity of that is strong. And then the impersonal aspect feels much more like an investigation of the nature of perceiving itself, the nature of experience itself, the nature of appearance, which is pretty impersonal. But these do go hand in hand, and if you're not addressing both, often it's very easy to overlook deeper aspects of realization. So, just to summarize, a simple definition for the distinction between consciousness and awareness that I stole from Nisargadatta, but it's very useful and true and accurate, is that consciousness is self-aware. It has the ability to be self-aware. I would just add it has the ability to be self-aware in a dualistic sense and also in a non-dualistic sense. That's consciousness. It's what thought is made of. It's what everything you've ever thought of is made of. All the perceptions you've ever had about yourself, the world, others, your storyline, narratives, intellect, all of it, information. And then awareness is sort of this very, very subtle, primary, thin background space, if you will, a sort of substanceless matrix of reality. That's how it's experienced. But even that can be penetrated as you move into true non-dual realization. The intimacy is the key there. Without the ongoing intimacy, the vulnerability, but also the equanimity and bliss of non-dual, non-spacious experience, then there's more work to do. There's still more work to do after that, but as far as awareness is concerned, keep penetrating, keep digging, keep looking closer and closer at your experience. See what's really there. What's not there will ultimately subside, the experience of it. That's the beauty of this, is it really just comes down to clear seeing.